The dark side of the franchise is a pathway to many stories some consider to be unnatural. So I put off doing this review for a couple of reasons. Firstly, I wasn't really thinking that I'd do reviews on this channel, but then I thought, why not give it a go? And secondly, I just wanted to see where the whole cultural conversation lands. With any fan-driven film, especially Star Wars films, there tends to be a lot of emotion and opinion when a film first comes out. So I just wanted to see where that whole conversation settles so that we can actually talk about it. Now, to be honest, full disclosure, it takes a lot for me to dislike a film. I think when you're a filmmaker, you tend to fit in one of two camps. Either you deconstruct the entire film and gravitate towards the things you don't like about it, or you deconstruct a film and gravitate towards the things you do like about it. And I'm definitely in the latter of those camps. I can usually find something to like in most films. So that being said, when it comes to The Rise of Skywalker, I actually really liked this film. I mean, is it a perfect film? No. And I definitely enjoyed it more the second time around. So I encourage everyone to go see it again. And overall, I found that there was a lot more to like here than to hate. So I just want to spend a few minutes highlighting the things that I really enjoyed in this film, and perhaps deconstructing a little bit the things that didn't quite work. Oh, and spoilers ahead. Now, I'm the first to admit I'm a big fan of Rey, and I have been since The Force Awakens.
Oh, I'm just a humble scavenger from the desert, but I speak RP English.
So the fact that it was a very Rey-centric story, and it is a very Rey-centric story, was something that I personally enjoyed. Across the 3 sequel films, hers is the emotional journey that we're obviously supposed to connect with, and I really did more than any of the other protagonists across the saga. I never really connected with Anakin, I never really connected with Luke, but I did with Rey. And I think Daisy Ridley gave a fantastic performance with the material she was given. In fact, the performances overall were a real highlight for me. In the first 2 sequel films, we never really saw Finn and Poe together that much, and seeing their dynamic in this film made the 2 characters feel complete. I finally understand all the Finn and Poe shippers out there, though I'm still not really one myself.
It's okay that you're here.
It's good. Does she do that to us?
And while we're on the topic of performances, Star Wars continues to be a masterclass in acting through masks. The advent of the superhero genre has brought mask performance back into pop culture a bit, but this film proves that Star Wars is still the king, especially with C-3PO played by Anthony Daniels and Chewbacca played by Johannes Tsunamatu.
Joonas Suotamo.
The visuals were another highlight for me, especially in the 3rd act. Unlike some people, I actually loved the fact that the visuals stayed that dark blue tone through the 3rd act. It felt like something we hadn't seen in Star Wars before. I mean, in the films at least. And just on the visuals, the second time I saw this film, we could only get tickets in the front row, and most newer cinemas in Australia have the reclining seats, and so we just sort of reclined back all the way and just let the visuals overtake us. It was really great. And my final highlight of the film, with an asterisk, was the fan service. Some of it at least. Now, I appreciate that fan service is a very difficult needle to thread, and overall, I do actually think that there was a bit too much. But there were a couple of moments of fan service that actually got me quite emotional. One in particular. I think most Star Wars fans know which. Now on to some of the issues I had with the film. I don't think this is going to come as a shock to anyone. It's not a bold statement, but this film has some pacing issues. There has been a lot of discussion, especially online, about the fact that this film is very fast-paced and you don't really have quiet moments to connect with the characters. And I totally understand that feeling. There is a lot going on. When I saw the film the second time, knowing that there was a pacing problem, I sat there and watched the various plot points and tried to figure out what the issue with the pacing was. And what I think is this. All the previous Star Wars films very strictly held to a 3-act plot structure, especially the original trilogy. George Lucas was almost fanatical about three-act structure, strictly adhering to it not only within the films themselves, but within the trilogies as a whole, with each film effectively forming one act in a larger story. In the original films, you can almost tell where the act changes because the location changes. In A New Hope, first act Tatooine, second act Death Star, third act in space. Empire Strikes Back, first act Hoth, second act Dagobah, third act Bespin. Return of the Jedi, first act Tatooine again, second act Endor, third act lots of different places. But with The Rise of Skywalker, you're jumping around a lot more to a lot of different places, despite the fact that it is a more linear story. And that's when it hit me. This is more of a 5-act film. The more I looked into the idea that this might be a 5-act film, the more it made sense to me. I found this graphic basically detailing 5-act structure, and I was able to map onto it pretty perfectly the major plot points of Rey's journey in The Rise of Skywalker. The result is that the film has major plot points and emotional beats in very different places than you would expect in a normal Star Wars film. For example, 3/4 of the way through the film, where you would normally cross from Act 2 to Act 3, you would have a relatively calm point as the hero resolves to definitively end the quest. The Falcon makes it to the Rebel base and Luke joins the attack on the Death Star. But with The Rise of Skywalker, at the 3/4 point, we're having these big emotional moments with Rey and Luke on the Jedi Island, and Kylo, seriously, spoilers, with the ghost of Han on the Death Star wreckage. This feels more like the refusal of return that we would expect to see at a 3rd, 4th act threshold in a 5-act story structure. Now, I'm not sure if thinking about this different structure makes the film any better, or even if it really fits. But I think it might explain why some people are so put off by this film. Across 9 films, 3 trilogies, we have been conditioned to expect a certain type of story, even if it's on a subconscious level. And when one of those films doesn't fit the pattern, we don't like it, and we don't really know why. At this point, a whole heap has been written about and talked about the fact that The Rise of Skywalker tries to walk back a whole heap of narrative changes made by Rian Johnson in The Last Jedi. Things like the whole situation around Rey's parents and the fact that the Resistance suddenly has a whole heap of people again. But the one I want to touch on is the downgrading of Rose. Rose was a major character in The Last Jedi for which Lucasfilm and Disney received a whole heap of unwarranted backlash. It was really ugly, showing some of the worst parts of fandom. So it was really unfortunate that Rose was reduced to about 90 seconds of screen time in The Rise of Skywalker. It really felt like Lucasfilm was trying to placate to the fans that they lost with The Last Jedi, and who arguably contributed to Solo underperforming. Now, writer Chris Terrio has gone on record as saying that there was a lot more Rose material, but she largely interacted with Leia, and that the visual effects used to bring the late Carrie Fisher's performance to the screen just weren't up to the standard they were expecting, and it had to be cut. There is a part of me, probably the screenwriter solidarity part of me, that is willing to take that explanation at face value. But I think that people like Lucasfilm, Disney, and any property that deals with large fan bases have to make sure that they're not indulging the worst instincts of fandom. Now, I am actually planning to do a full video essay on the tribalism of fan culture a bit later in the year, so I don't want to touch on that too much now. But what I will say is that I genuinely believe that the relationship between fans and filmmakers needs to be a partnership. The fans are not the chattel of the filmmakers who should just accept anything the filmmakers throw down, but at the same time, the filmmakers are not the servants of the fans who should just jump at every command. There needs to be a balance between giving the fans the world and characters and stories that they love, and giving the filmmakers space to have artistic freedom, which the franchise will need to grow. Now, the final thing I wanted to talk about in relation to The Rise of Skywalker is actually the use of the Emperor. Now again, full disclosure, I'm a big fan of the Emperor. I think Ian McDiarmid is a fantastic actor, and he is clearly having the time of his life every time he plays the Emperor. And in fact, I actually think I like the prequels more than most people do, because I just love seeing Ian McDiarmid chewing scenery and delighting in being evil.
The dark side of the Force is a pathway to many abilities some consider to be unnatural.
But I was disappointed with how the Emperor was used in this film. Not only was he not used that much, but he also didn't feel like much of a threat. The film kept telling me he was one, but it just didn't really have an impact. The threat didn't feel real. In many ways, the Sith Star Destroyers as machines felt like more of a threat than the man behind them, and I wanted to know why. In preparation for this review, I actually went back and watched both The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, just to see how the Emperor was established initially, and the basic narrative tactic seemed to be evil by comparison. Before he actually appears in person in Return of the Jedi, most of his mentions and appearances are aimed at saying he's worse than Darth Vader. Hey, you know that guy that you've been afraid of all this time? Well, here's a guy that he kneels before and makes him look small. Vader would be the lesser of two evils when it comes to ruling the galaxy. But when it comes to this Vader bad, Emperor worse approach, the MVP is actually this guy. In the first scene of Return of the Jedi, Darth Vader arrives to find out why the Death Star is behind schedule. This guy, his name is Tianji Jarrett, and he has children and grandchildren. So do you feel bad about blowing him up now? Seriously, that's canon. Complains to Vader about staff problems and even tries to blame the Emperor.
But he asked the impossible. I need more men.
Then when Vader says the Emperor will be coming in person, he says,
We shall double our efforts.
and then just to put the cherry on top of this compare and contrast sundae, Vader says,
I hope so, Commander, for your sake. The Emperor is not as forgiving as I am.
So this character that we've seen strangle people psychically, torture people, and cut his own son's hand off is describing himself as forgiving by comparison. But in The Rise of Skywalker, we don't get the same comparisons. Kylo Ren is all moody and conflicted and possibly love-struck. And even if they did try the same compare and contrast method, which they didn't, it wouldn't have the same impact. Just a quick aside, the Skywalker men have always been moody whiners. Stop making fun of Kylo Ren.
But I was going into Tashi Station to pick up some power converters.
The approach of establishing the Emperor as a threat in The Rise of Skywalker is he's a threat in all the other ones. And this ultimately is the danger of franchise storytelling. There's an expectation that you can take themes and plot points from previous films and sometimes even other mediums and expect the audience to transplant them into your film on their own. I think everyone is looking at what the MCU is doing and thinks that they can do the same thing, but Star Wars is not the MCU. It spans a much wider period of time and it crosses mediums where this MCU really doesn't. Even beyond The Rise of Skywalker, both Solo and the recent Mandalorian finale had twists in the end that wouldn't make sense unless you had seen Clone Wars or the Rebels cartoon series. And I just don't think the average moviegoer or even the average Star Wars fan is across all of the different properties in that way. And especially if it is an element that is vital to your story, like establishing the central conflict or establishing the threat of the antagonist. That is something you should really be doing yourself in your story, even if it means retreading material from other places in the franchise. If they had taken some time to re-establish the Emperor as the ultimate threat, as the big bad of this trilogy, then I think The Rise of Skywalker would have been a lot more satisfying. And even beyond the Emperor, things like the Cult of the Sith, the Restoration of Mustafar, and the Imperial Remnant, all of which arguably appear in this film, just feel like confusing plot holes if you don't have the knowledge from other mediums. Maybe someone should do a video essay about cross-medium storytelling and transmedia narrative. Now, I know that I've spent more time than really anybody asked for deconstructing the issues of this film, but let me say again, I actually really liked it. And to be honest, now that some of the initial outrage is dying down, the fan conversation seems to be settling in a similar place. It seems to be ranging from people like me who actually really enjoyed it, through to people who will accept it as a flawed but fun part of the franchise. Now, there will always be detractors, and those detractors will always be loud. But With the film crossing $1 billion this week, I think Disney will feel comfortable that there is still life in this franchise. But the question is, now that the Skywalker Saga is over, where do we go from here? As both a filmmaker and a fan, I thought I would just quickly give you some of my ideas. Firstly, and I'm sure this will come as a surprise to no one, I would really like to continue Rey's story. I think there's a lot more to explore with this character. What is it like being a Jedi in this new galaxy? But unfortunately, I don't think they'll do that. One of the things I would love for them to explore is actually the rise of the First Order. How did it come to be? It was actually one of the big questions I had after The Force Awakens. And I think there could be some really interesting stories and some really interesting themes that they could explore in that space. Similar to that, life under the Empire. It was one of the really interesting parts of Rogue One for me, and I think that there's a lot more to explore. And with the Obi-Wan series and Cassian Andor series on Disney+, I think we're going to be getting a lot more of that coming up soon. I know there's a lot of fans out there who want to go down the whole Knights of the Old Republic road. I personally never played the game, so I'm not particularly fussed. I mean, it sounds cool, but I could take it or leave it. Finally, I just want to say something about the overall theme of the sequel trilogy. I've read a lot of articles recently about how the Rise of Skywalker changed the themes of the sequel trilogy, and I actually don't agree. For me, the overall theme of the sequel trilogy, the Rise of Skywalker included, is finding out who you are for yourself. That you are not bound by where you come from. And whether you're a former stormtrooper or the progeny of evil, a rogue or from nowhere, you are who you choose to become.
The Force will be with you.
Always.
Thank you so much for sitting through my thoughts on the Rise of Skywalker. I would love to hear yours. Within reason, don't be a tool. So please leave a comment below, maybe your highlights and lowlights. If you like this video, please hit the like button. If you're interested in more content like this, including my first video essay coming out soon, then please hit the subscribe button. See you soon. I'm trying to come up with a catchphrase, but I don't know. Am I a real YouTuber if I don't have a catchphrase?